What you are about to hear will stay with you, a mother said for words to her daughter one Sunday afternoon. Be careful, princess. I love you. She watched her walk out the front door. She expected her back in 20 minutes. She never saw her alive again. If this story moves you the way it moved me, hit that like button right now, subscribe to this channel, and share this video so Christy Wessleman's name reaches every corner of this platform. She deserves that. Her family deserves that. Now let's make sure the world never forgets her. This is the story of Christy Wessleman, a 15-year-old girl who walked to the store and never came home. A case that stayed cold for 30 years. And a killer who thought he had gotten away with it forever. He almost did. In 1985, a walk to the Jewel was not a risk. It was an errand. Glen Ellyn, Illinois sat in DuPage County, west of Chicago. And it was exactly the kind of place families moved to on purpose. Tree-lined streets. Neighbors who waved from their driveways. Kids who stayed out until the streetlights came on, and nobody panicked. DuPage County had one of the lowest crime rates in the entire state. The worst thing that happened most summers was a stolen bicycle or a broken window. Sandy Wessleman had no reason to feel afraid that afternoon. Not yet. Christy was born on April 19, 1970. The youngest daughter in the Wessleman household. She grew up in the Valley View subdivision with her parents Sandy and Bob, her brothers Bill and Greg, and her older sister Susan. By 15, she had already figured out who she was. At Glenbard South High School, while most freshmen were still finding their locker combinations, Christy was running for class president and winning. She didn't win because she was popular, though she was. She won because people trusted her. Teachers leaned on her. Younger students looked up to her. She had already been chosen to serve as sophomore class president the following year. At 15, she had a trajectory that pointed straight out of Glen Ellyn and into something significant. She played volleyball. She played basketball. She was a reader. Her mother would spend years trying to find the right words to describe her. And the ones she kept coming back to were simple. Vibrant. Spirited. Gifted. Amazing. She wasn't done yet. That was the thing. She was just getting started. July 21, 1985 was a Sunday, and it started the way the best summer days do, with no real plan. Sandy and Christy had decided to spend the afternoon inside watching old movies together. Nothing special. Just a mother and her daughter on a warm Illinois afternoon with nowhere to be and nothing urgent waiting. Then Sandy wanted some candy. The Jewel supermarket was close. Just a short walk along the well-worn path that residents of Valley View used all the time, cutting through the neighborhood toward the corner of Butterfield Road and Illinois Route 53. Kids made that trip constantly. It was so routine that nobody thought twice about it. Christy slipped on her sneakers, grabbed a little money, said she'd be right back. Sandy watched her go. And right before Christy stepped away, she said those words. Be careful, princess. I love you. She had no way of knowing that was the last thing she would ever say to her daughter. Inside the Jewel that afternoon, Christy was exactly herself. The store hummed with the sounds of a Sunday grocery run. Shopping carts rolling across linoleum. The beep of a cash register. A pop song drifting from the speakers. Christy stood in line, bought a candy bar and a can of soda, and walked out into the warm July air. The checkout clerk knew her. He had seen her in that store dozens of times. He watched her leave and thought nothing of it because there was nothing to think. She seemed happy. Relaxed. She was just a kid heading home. She was caught on the store surveillance camera that day. Grainy footage, the way everything looked in 1985. Washed out shapes more than clear images. But it was enough to confirm she was there. She was fine. And she left. What happened on the path between that store and her front door is what this entire story is about. 20 minutes passed. Sandy wasn't concerned. Christy had probably run into a friend. Maybe stop to talk to a neighbor. Summer afternoons had a way of stretching. That was fine. That was expected. Then the sun started to drop. The golden light that had been pouring through the windows began to shift, turning amber, then orange, then fading toward something darker. Sandy turned on the porch light. She picked up the phone, the kind that sat heavy in your hand and clicked when you dialed, and started calling Christy's friends one by one. "Have you seen her? Is she with you? Did she stop by?" Every answer was the same. "No, we haven't seen her today." Sandy put the phone down. She stood on the porch and looked out at a street that was getting quieter by the minute. The neighborhood kids had gone inside. The street lights were starting to flicker on. And her daughter still wasn't home. She left the house and walked toward the store herself, moving quickly now, scanning every yard, every driveway, every face she passed. Nothing. The family spent the next several hours searching. They drove the street slowly, windows down, calling her name into the dark. They knocked on doors. They checked every place Christy might have gone. The night got deeper. The streets got quieter. By 1:50 in the morning, with no sign of her daughter anywhere and no explanation that held together, Sandy Wessleman picked up that heavy phone one more time and called the police. Officers arrived and began building a timeline. They spoke to the jewel clerk. They located witnesses who had seen Christy inside the store. They confirmed she had been there around 4 in the afternoon, bought her items, and left. And then the trail stopped. The search pushed through the rest of the night. Flashlights sweeping across dark yards. Voices calling her name into the silence. Every street checked. Every shadow examined. By morning, there was still nothing. A new team of officers took over at midday. One of them made a quiet suggestion. He thought Christy had probably taken the shortcut, the path through the field that all the neighborhood kids used. He decided to walk it himself. As the morning sun began burning the dew off the tall Illinois sawgrass, the detective stepped off the pavement and into the field. He wasn't looking for a body. He was looking for a girl. In a few steps, the two were about to become the same thing. The detective's name hasn't been written into history the way killers' names are. But on the morning of July 22, 1985, he walked into a field that nobody else had thought to check. And what he found there would haunt DuPage County for the next 3 decades. The overnight search had found nothing. Officers had worked through the dark hours, covering streets, checking lots, following every direction the initial investigation pointed. Methodical. Thorough. Logical. That was the problem. Because the answer wasn't somewhere logical. It was somewhere close. Uncomfortably, impossibly close. Hiding in plain sight between the Jewel supermarket and the Valley View subdivision, in a stretch of overgrown land that adults in cars never thought about because they never needed to. They drove around it. But kids didn't drive. Kids walked. And every kid in that neighborhood knew the shortcut that cut straight through that field. A narrow dirt trail worn flat by years of sneakers and bicycle tires, connecting the store to the subdivision in a fraction of the time the long route took. If Christy had taken the most direct path home, she had walked into that field. Around midday, a fresh detective team took over. One of them looked at the map. Then he looked at the field. Then he made a quiet decision and stepped off the pavement. The path was easy to follow at first. Just a thin line through the brush where the ground had been walked bare over years of use. The July heat pressed down on everything. Insects hummed in the goldenrod. Somewhere behind him, Butterfield Road carried the distant sound of a passing car. He kept walking. Then something made him stop. A few yards off the left side of the trail, the sawgrass was pushed down in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. The earth dipped slightly there, just enough to create a small hidden hollow in the thicket. It wasn't visible from the path unless you were standing at exactly the right angle. He pushed through the dry stalks, boots snapping through the undergrowth. And then the world went silent. There, in the depression of the earth, where the goldenrod was matted flat against the ground, the search ended. He didn't need to check a pulse. He didn't need to call her name. He just reached for his radio, hand shaking, and called for the tape. It was 11:15 in the morning. The usual noise of a police response died the moment officers entered that hollow. Men who had worked 100 crime scenes looked at the dirt, or at the sky, or at the tops of the sawgrass. Anywhere but at the small broken figure lying in the earth. Nobody spoke above a murmur. Nobody moved quickly. This wasn't just a crime scene they were processing. It was something that felt like a violation of a different order entirely. Christy was just a few yards from the path. Close enough that someone walking by at the right moment might have heard something. The thicket had hidden her completely. She was partially unclothed. The medical examiner worked carefully and deliberately. The forensic report confirmed that Christy had been subjected to an unthinkable violation before her life was taken. The attacker had used extreme force, leaving behind evidence of a struggle that was both cold and calculated. A shoelace had been used as a ligature. That last detail stopped investigators. A shoelace doesn't appear at a crime scene by accident. It means the killer either came prepared, or he was calm enough in that moment to use what was available to him. Either way, it pointed toward someone who didn't panic. Someone who knew what he was doing and took the time to do it completely. This was not a random act of chaos. This was controlled, deliberate violence. A few feet from her body, half buried in the dirt, investigators found a candy bar. Half eaten. She had still been eating it when he took her off that path. That single detail, a 15-year-old girl with a candy bar in her hand heading home on a Sunday afternoon, collapsed the distance between a statistic and a human being in a way that no official report ever could. She had no warning. No moment to prepare. No chance to run. Whatever he did it fast. Forensic specialists moved through the scene for hours. They found nothing usable. The hard summer ground had taken no footprints. There were no fibers, no foreign objects, no physical trail leading away from the hollow. Whatever the killer had touched, the earth had already reclaimed. What investigators did recover was biological material collected during the examination. In 1985, this should have been the break that solved everything. In 1985, it was almost useless. DNA analysis existed in research settings, but it had not yet crossed into standard criminal procedure. There was no national database to run a profile against. No established forensic protocol to follow. No mechanism to take what was sitting in that evidence kit and connect it to a name. The science simply wasn't there yet. The sample was sealed, labeled with a case number, and locked into storage. It would sit there for 15 years before the world caught up to it. Sandy Wessleman gave investigators one more detail that she would carry with her for decades. Christy had been wearing a ring that day. A small gold band, size 4.5, set with a single pearl that had a small chip in it. Not a store-bought piece of jewelry. A family heirloom. The kind that holds memory rather than monetary value. It was not on her finger. It was not anywhere at the scene. The killer had taken it. Police made a deliberate decision in the days that followed. They would not tell the public about the ring. They would not describe it to reporters or release it in press statements. They held it back as a filter. Because in any investigation, there is always someone who calls in a false confession or a fabricated tip. And a person who mentioned a small gold ring with a chipped pearl without being told about it first had knowledge that could only have come from one place. Officers quietly began monitoring pawn shops across DuPage County. No one ever tried to sell it. What unnerved detectives most wasn't the violence. It was the silence. That same Sunday afternoon, a family had been hosting a backyard barbecue just a few dozen yards from the hollow where Christy was found. They had been outside for hours. Cooking. Moving around their yard. They heard nothing that struck them as unusual. A gas station sat 60 yards from the edge of the field. An employee had worked a full shift. He heard nothing either. Several residents had walked the same path that afternoon, passing within yards of where it happened. Not one of them reported anything wrong. The attack had been completely, utterly silent. Investigators worked with two theories. The first was that the killer had followed Christy from the duel, keeping enough distance to avoid notice, waiting for the moment she stepped into the brush. The second was that he was already somewhere along that path when she walked into him, and he moved the instant the grass closed around them. Both theories pointed to the same conclusion. This was not impulsive. This was predatory. He had read the environment, understood the cover the thicket provided, and used it with a precision that left no witnesses and no sound. That kind of stillness doesn't happen by accident. It comes from someone who has done this before. Or someone who has thought about it for a very long time. By the evening of July 22, 1985, DuPage County had a murder with no suspect, no witnesses, and no physical evidence that 1985 science could use. What they had was a sealed evidence kit in a locked storage room. The killer had stepped back onto the pavement and walked away as quietly as he had come. He left behind a community that would never feel safe in the same way again. A mother who would never stop waiting for an answer. And one small biological sample that had no voice yet. But the science was coming. And it had a very long memory. 3 years passed. 3 years of tips that went nowhere. 3 years of suspects interviewed and cleared. 3 years of a family waiting by a phone that never rang with the right news. 3 years of a community that had stopped feeling safe and started feeling watched. By 1988, the investigation had quietly stalled. The original momentum was gone. Every lead that had seemed promising in the early months had collapsed under scrutiny. Detectives had worked the case hard. And the case had given them nothing back. Then something changed. In the late 1980s, DNA analysis was crossing from laboratory science into actual criminal investigation for the first time. The databases were incomplete and the processing was slow. But for a case with no fingerprints, no witnesses, and no physical trail, it represented something investigators hadn't had in years. A new angle. Detectives went back through every person who had ever been considered a suspect and asked each one for a voluntary DNA sample. Blood and saliva. Simple. If your DNA didn't match the biological evidence collected at the scene, you were cleared and you went home. One by one, the men on that list agreed. One by one, they were eliminated. And then detectives reached a name that had been sitting on their radar since the very first week of the investigation. Dana Henry. Henry was 34 years old. He lived near the field where Christy's body had been found. His mother's backyard sat approximately 100 yards from the hollow in the sawgrass where the detective had found her that July morning. 100 yards. That was the entirety of the original suspicion. Not a witness placing him there. Not a timeline that put him on the path. Just proximity. Just the bad luck of where his mother happened to live. He had denied involvement from the beginning. He had cooperated with early questioning. But now, when detectives came back and asked for a DNA sample, Dana Henry said no. To the detectives, a refusal in a murder investigation felt like a confession. But to Henry, it was something different. He believed that in America, a man shouldn't have to surrender his body to a system that already looked at him like a monster in order to prove he wasn't one. It was a matter of principle. A line in the sand. That line cost him everything. Police sought a court order. Henry appeared at the hearing. He sat in that courtroom and said exactly what he had been saying since 1985. He was innocent. He had nothing to do with it. He had never even met Christy Wessleman. The judge charged him with contempt of court. Henry was taken to a local jail cell. What happened next is difficult to read even now. According to Henry, he was stripped of his clothing and held in that cell without charges, without his Miranda rights being read, under sustained pressure that was designed to have exactly one outcome. He was kept there for days until he finally broke and agreed to provide the sample. His DNA did not match. Dana Henry had nothing to do with Christy Wessleman's murder. He had never been near that hollow in the sawgrass. He was, in every legal and biological sense, an innocent man. But the damage had already been done in ways that a lab result could never reach. The legal fees came to approximately $50,000. In the late 1980s, that wasn't an abstract number. That was a mortgage. And it was, in fact, his mortgage. He took it out to pay the lawyers, and he eventually lost the house entirely. The money was only the beginning. Friends disappeared. Family members pulled away. In a tight community where everyone knew everyone, being publicly associated with a child's murder, even as a suspect who was never formally charged, was enough to permanently alter how people saw you. Some never stopped believing he was guilty. The DNA result didn't matter to them. The suspicion had hardened into something that biology couldn't dissolve. Henry moved to LaSalle County and rebuilt what life he could from the pieces that remained. The DNA had cleared his name. But the investigation had killed the version of Dana Henry that existed before 1988. He survived. But he came out of it fundamentally changed. Decades later, sitting across from reporters, he described what those years had felt like in 2 sentences that needed no elaboration. "I've had 2 settings over the last 30 years, he said. Angry and depressed. He also said this about the night in the jail cell. They never read me my rights. So I guess I never had any. Not one person from the DuPage County Sheriff's Office ever apologized to Dana Henry. Not in 1988 when the DNA cleared him. Not in 2015 when the real killer was identified. Not in 2018 when that killer was sentenced. Across 30 years, through every development in the case, nobody in an official capacity ever acknowledged what had been done to him. He had never even met Christy Wessleman. While Henry was living through that destruction, the Wessleman family was enduring something different but equally relentless. In late 1985, a local man named Willis had begun contacting them. He claimed to have information about the killer's identity and started sending tips, names, theories, elaborate scenarios. The family passed each one to police. Detectives followed up on every lead Willis provided. Every single one dissolved on contact with reality. Factually wrong. Logically incoherent. Completely disconnected from anything in the actual investigation. But Willis kept going, month after month, for nearly 4 years. Each new tip forcing the family to revisit a wound they were desperately trying to survive. By 1989, the family had reached their limit. They filed a complaint. A judge issued a restraining order. Willis was legally barred from contacting them again. Police investigated Willis himself. He had no connection to the crime. By the close of the 1980s, the shape of this case had become almost unbearable to look at directly. One innocent man had been financially destroyed and socially erased by a system that was supposed to find the truth. One obsessive stranger had been silenced by a court order. The Wessleman family had survived years of grief layered with harassment. And the actual killer had not been touched by any of it. He had not been interviewed. He had not been sampled. He had not been named once in any document connected to this investigation. While DuPage County turned itself inside out, he was living his life 150 miles away. Completely unknown. Completely unworried. The real killer wasn't just free. He was completely invisible. And he had been for a very long time. The 1990s arrived and the case file sat in a drawer. Tips still came in occasionally. Detectives followed each one to its end, watched it dissolve, and returned to the same wall they had been staring at since 1985. The investigation never fully stopped. It just slowed to something that barely had a pulse. Outside that drawer, the world kept moving without Christy in it. Her Glenbard South classmates graduated. The kids who had walked the same Valley View streets, shared the same hallways, used the same shortcut through the field. They left Glen Ellyn and built lives that stretched forward in all the ways lives are supposed to. They went to college. They found people to love. They stood at altars and made promises in front of everyone they cared about. They held their own newborns in hospital rooms. They sat at kitchen tables watching their children do homework. They went to school plays and soccer games and ordinary Tuesday dinners that meant nothing and everything at the same time. Christy's classmates turned 20, then 30, then 40. Christy stayed 15. Sandy didn't leave. She kept the same phone number. She sat in the same rooms where she and Christy had planned to watch old movies that Sunday afternoon. To the neighbors, it was just a house on a quiet street. To Sandy, it was a lighthouse kept lit year after year, just in case the truth finally decided to come home. She called the sheriff's office. She asked if anything was new. The answer never changed. She called again the next time. Anyway, because stopping felt like a second loss she was not willing to accept. In the year 2000, investigators submitted the DNA profile to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database built exactly for cases like this one. A profile with no name attached entered into a system that compared it automatically against convicted offenders across the country. Every year after that, the system got faster. The algorithms got smarter. The database grew by millions of names. New offenders were entered every single day from every state in the country. And every year, that silent profile from 1985 scanned those millions of entries and found nothing. It was a digital ghost looking for a match that didn't exist in the system yet. The case went cold in a specific, agonizing way that only a DNA case can go cold. Not dead. Just frozen at the edge of an answer that was somewhere in the world, attached to a living, breathing person, but had not yet been entered into any database anywhere. In 2002, something happened in Springfield that would matter enormously, though nobody understood how much yet. Joe Burkett, who had served as DuPage County State's attorney and carried Christie's case as a professional wound for years, pushed a new law through the Illinois legislature. From that point forward, any person convicted of a felony in Illinois was required to submit a DNA sample to the state database. Burkett said directly that Christie's case had driven him to fight for it. A murder with a clean DNA profile sitting in CODIS, catching nothing, because the man responsible had never been entered into any system. The law was designed to close exactly that gap. It was a gun loaded quietly in 2002 and placed on a shelf. Nobody in that room knew whose name it would eventually fire. That information was still 13 years away. The original detectives retired. New investigators inherited the file the way you inherit an old debt, with full responsibility and none of the history. They came without the memory of that July morning. Without the weight of having sat across from Sandy Wessleman through 3 decades of the same answer. But they came with the same obligation. The case was open. The DNA was waiting. The ring was still missing. In 2011, Sandy made a decision. She stood at a press conference and released a detail that investigators had protected for 26 years. The ring. The small gold band, size 4.5, with a chipped pearl setting that had been on Christie's finger when she walked out the door and had never been seen again. They had kept it hidden deliberately, holding it as a filter. A fact so specific that only one person on Earth knew it without being told. Now there was nothing left to protect it for. The leads had dried up. Every trail had gone cold in every direction. The ring was the last card left to play. Sandy stood at that podium. And then she stopped addressing the room and spoke directly to the man she had spent 26 years waiting to face. She spoke slowly. Deliberately. There's a man out there who thinks he got away with murder. A pause. Please help us take away his dream. He stole all of Christie's. The tip lines generated some activity. Detectives worked through 25 new leads over the following year. Every single one dissolved. After 2011, the silence returned like it had never left. Glen Ellen had learned to live alongside the not knowing. New families had moved into Valley View. New students filled the halls at Glenbard South. The town remembered. But it had learned to keep going without resolution. That is what communities do. They absorb the wound and they move. Sandy had not moved. She kept the lighthouse burning. She kept asking the question that had no answer yet. Most people had let the silence win. Sandy never did. And then on September 10, 2015, a computer at the DuPage County Crime Laboratory processed what looked like a routine database comparison. The profile that had been sitting in CODIS for 15 years. The biological evidence sealed in a kit in 1985. Uploaded in 2000. Scanning millions of names through every year of silence that followed. Stopped on something. A notification loaded on a screen. After 30 years, the digital ghost had found its match. The screen lit up. And somewhere 150 miles away, a 62-year-old man who thought he had gotten away with everything was about to have the worst morning of his life. The name on the screen was Michael R. Jones. 62 years old. Champaign, Illinois. 150 miles from Glen Ellyn. The team pulled up his file and found something that stopped them cold. Not because of what was in it. Because of what wasn't. His name had never appeared in the Christy Wessleman case. Not once. Not as a suspect, a witness, a neighbor, an acquaintance, or a name mentioned in passing by anyone the investigation had ever touched. In 30 years of tips, leads, interviews, and dead ends, Michael R. Jones had never surfaced. The men who had spent their careers on this case had never heard of him. He had been completely, perfectly invisible. Here is how his DNA ended up in the system. In July of 2015, Jones had been arrested in Champaign County for aggravated domestic battery. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 1 year of probation. And under the Illinois law that Joe Burkett had fought to pass in 2002, the law inspired directly by Christie's unsolved murder, he was required to submit a DNA sample to the state database. He handed it over without resistance. He had no reason to believe it would connect him to anything. As far as the world was concerned, Michael Jones was just a 62-year-old man in Champaign who had gotten into a domestic dispute. A minor case barely worth a court date. The sample was processed. It entered CODIS. The system ran its comparison on September 10, 2015. It matched the profile that had been waiting in that database since the year 2000. The profile extracted from evidence collected at Christy Wessleman's autopsy. Sealed in a kit in 1985. Uploaded in 2000. Scanning silently through 15 years of growing databases. The gun that Joe Burkett had loaded in 2002 had finally fired. Investigators didn't call Sandy Wessleman. They boarded a plane to Colorado where she had been living and knocked on her door in person. Because after 30 years of phone calls with no answers, the answer deserved to arrive differently. It deserved to be carried by people who could sit across from her, look her in the eye, and say the words out loud. They told her they had a match. They told her they had a name. Sandy Wessleman, who had kept a lighthouse burning for 3 decades, who had sat in the same rooms where she and Christy had planned to watch old movies, who had never once stopped asking, heard the answer for the first time. Her son Bill put his own reaction into one sentence. My initial reaction is one of shock and awe. We have been waiting for news like this for 30 years. And it finally came. Now the authorities had a name. What they needed was the complete picture of the man behind it. What they found was not a monster hiding behind an elaborate disguise. It was something in some ways more disturbing. An ordinary-looking life built directly on top of a pattern of violence that the system had been given every opportunity to stop. Michael Jones had first come to the attention of law enforcement in 1976. That year, he targeted a woman named Judith Van Kirk. He assaulted her. The case did not end in a conviction. Van Kirk spent the following decades carrying what had been done to her with no legal acknowledgement that it had happened at all. Years later, standing outside a DuPage County courthouse after the sentencing, she introduced herself to the room in a single sentence. I was Michael Jones's first victim, she said. Not his first known victim. His first victim. The one who existed before the records. Before the convictions. Before anyone was paying attention to what kind of man Michael Jones actually was. A year after Van Kirk, he escalated in a way that removed any doubt about his nature. In 1977, an 18-year-old woman named Gary Michaels was riding her bicycle on the northwest side of Chicago. Jones drove his car directly into her, knocking her to the ground. He forced her into his residence under the threat of a weapon, where he committed a series of heinous acts that would leave a permanent scar on her life. This was not impulsive. This was a sequence of deliberate, premeditated actions. He used his vehicle as a weapon. He arrived with a gun. He had a destination already in mind. Jones was convicted. He stood in court and told the judge he deeply regretted his actions. He said he had great respect for the law, which was why he had surrendered voluntarily. He claimed serious mental health problems and asked for treatment. An independent psychiatrist examined him and reached a different conclusion. Jones was fully aware of everything he had done. He understood it completely. The judge sentenced him to 10 to 20 years. What the state handed Jones was a decade behind bars. Enough time, the system decided, to ensure he would never hunt again. But the same system then determined that 6 years of good behavior was sufficient to wipe the slate clean. The gates opened in 1983. The authorities let a wolf back into the world. And they didn't even bother to tell his previous victims he was gone. Gary Michaels found out the way victims so often find out, after the fact, when nothing could be undone. Had he served at least the 10 years, she said at the 2018 sentencing, her voice level and precise, we wouldn't be here today for this. Jones walked out of prison in 1983 on parole. 2 years later, on a warm Sunday afternoon in July 1985, he was somewhere in the area of Glen Ellyn. The investigators' best theory was that he traveled frequently on long solo trips and had family in the Chicago area, placing Glen Ellyn along routes he may have passed through regularly. If he was only there for a few hours, there would have been no reason for his name to appear in any local record. A 15-year-old girl walked out of a Jewel supermarket with a candy bar and a soda. He was still on parole for what he had done to Gary Michaels when he followed Christy into that field. After the DNA match, the team began assembling the full picture of Jones's life. In the 30 years between 1985 and 2015, he had married. His first wife had eventually left him and obtained a restraining order. The reason being an obsessive and inappropriate interest he had developed in one of her young relatives. No charges followed. In 1999, he was arrested again for assaulting a family member of a subsequent girlfriend. He had lived in Champaign for decades, described by neighbors as quiet and unremarkable. He had also been obsessed, according to people close to him, with detective novels and true crime television. He wasn't just a killer. He was a student of the craft. He sat in his quiet Champaign home, reading about forensic mistakes and watching investigators work on screen. Perhaps comfortable in the knowledge of an evidence kit sitting in a DuPage County storage room that had spent 30 years with nothing to say. What he didn't know was that the world outside that storage room had been changing. That the databases were growing. That a law passed in 2002 had been waiting specifically for a moment like his July 2015 arrest. He had been careful for 30 years. One domestic dispute ended all of it. The men who inherited Christie's case file looked at the pattern. The solo trips. The geography. The methodology of the 1985 attack. The decades of smaller violations that followed. And a question began forming that the DNA alone could not answer. Was Christy Wessleman the only one? On September 21, 2015, Michael R. Jones was arrested and taken to the DuPage County Jail. He was held without bail. When investigators sat across from him and showed him a photograph of Christy Wessleman, a 15-year-old girl who had been murdered 30 years earlier, Jones looked at the image and said something that told them everything they needed to know about the man they were dealing with. As God is my witness, I've never seen her before. Not a moment of hesitation. Not a flicker of recognition. Just a flat, practiced denial delivered by a man who had spent 30 years living as though that Sunday afternoon in 1985 had never happened. As though the field, the path, the candy bar, the sealed evidence kit. None of it existed. The DNA said otherwise. The DNA, it turned out, does not negotiate with a man's version of himself. The legal process moved slowly, the way it always does when the stakes are absolute. Jones sat in the DuPage County Jail through 2015, through 2016, through 2017. His attorneys challenged the evidence. They pushed for examination of a laboratory technician who had handled the DNA samples. They built a defense around the integrity of the testing process because when the biological evidence is unambiguous, the only available argument is to attack the chain of custody that produced it. The family waited again. 3 more years of waiting added on to 30 years of waiting. Because the system moves at the speed of procedure regardless of what a family has already survived. Then on January 18, 2018, Michael Jones appeared in a DuPage County courtroom before Judge George Barley's and entered a guilty plea to 1 count of murder. He had been scheduled for trial that same day. He chose at the last possible moment to spare himself the full exposure of a trial in exchange for a sentencing recommendation he could live with. The state had agreed to ask for 80 years rather than pursue natural life. The family had not been given 33 years back. But they had been given a guilty plea. An admission on the record, in open court, that Michael R. Jones had murdered Christy Wessleman. 5 days later, on January 23, 2018, they gathered in Wheaton for the sentencing. Sandy Wessleman was 78 years old. She walked into that courtroom carrying a photograph of her daughter. She sat through the proceedings. And when the moment came for her to speak, she stood up and delivered an 11-minute victim impact statement that she had waited 33 years to give. She glanced at Jones only once. She did not speak to him. She spoke about Christy. About who she was and what had been taken from the people who loved her. Not in abstractions. But in the specific, irreplaceable details of a life that had been stopped at 15 and never allowed to continue. Christy was murdered on July 21, 1985. She said, "We were denied our right to see what the final results of her journey would have been." She described what Christy had missed, not as a list of milestones, but as a series of moments that had happened to everyone around her and never to her. Christy did not have the chance to go to her brothers' or sisters' weddings. She never knew the joy of getting to know her nieces and nephews. She paused. What she would have become will forever be an unfinished book. That phrase, an unfinished book, landed in that courtroom and stayed there. Because it wasn't just grief speaking. It was a mother who had spent 33 years watching the story her daughter should have been living, playing out in the lives of everyone around her, while Christy's own pages stayed blank. Judy Van Kirk was in that courtroom. Gary Michaels was in that courtroom. The women who had survived Michael Jones before Christy, one whose case never produced a conviction, one whose case produced a sentence that was cut in half, sat in the same room as the man who had moved through their lives like a slow, patient catastrophe. Gary Michaels had said her piece outside the courthouse. Van Kirk looked at the room and spoke about innocence stolen and love that survived it. Bob Wessleman, Christy's father, stood alongside the state's attorney. Jones sat at the defense table throughout all of it. He said nothing. Not a word of explanation. Not an acknowledgement. Not a single sentence directed at the people in that room whose lives he had permanently altered. He had entered his guilty plea 5 days earlier. And that apparently was the full extent of what he was willing to offer. Judge George Barley's looked at the man in front of him and delivered the sentence. 80 years. Parole eligible no earlier than 2055. At the age of 64, the judge said, "This is essentially a life sentence." Based on his conduct, the defendant has earned each and every day of his sentence. Jones would be over 140 years old before he was eligible for release. He will die in prison. That is not a speculation. That is arithmetic. There was one more person in that courtroom who deserves to be named. Dana Henry had driven to Wheaton to watch the sentencing of the man whose crime had been used to destroy him. He had spent 30 years in the wreckage of a suspicion that should never have attached to his name. He had lost his house, his money, his relationships, and in many ways the version of himself that had existed before 1988. He came to that courtroom hoping that watching the real killer receive justice would give him something back. It didn't. He told reporters afterward that the closure he had hoped for simply wasn't there. The verdict hadn't returned what had been taken from him. The sentence hadn't restored a single year of the life that had been dismantled by a system that was supposed to find the truth and instead had found the nearest available target. "I've had two settings over the last 30 years, he had once said. Angry and depressed. Standing outside that courthouse in January 2018, with the real killer finally behind bars, the setting hadn't changed. Not one person from the DuPage County Sheriff's Office had ever apologized to Dana Henry. Not in 1988. Not in 2015. Not on January 23, 2018. Across 30 years and every development in this case, no one in an official capacity ever acknowledged what had been done to him. He had never even met Christy Wessleman. After the sentencing, Christy's former classmates, the ones who had grown up while she stayed 15, who had held their own children while her story stayed frozen, came together to do something. They reinstated the Christina Wessleman Memorial Scholarship at Glenbard South High School. The scholarship is awarded every year to the student who serves as freshman class president, the same role Christy had held. Because while Michael Jones spent 30 years believing he had erased a 15-year-old girl from the story of DuPage County, Christy's name was being carried forward quietly and persistently by the people who had loved her. He took her life. He did not take her legacy. Every year, a new student at Glenbard South steps into a leadership role and carries her name with them into their future. The future she was never allowed to have. That is what he could not touch. That is what survived him. Sandy Wessleman watched her daughter walk out a front door on a Sunday afternoon in 1985 and said 4 words she didn't know would be the last. Michael Jones took 30 years, one domestic dispute, and a law inspired by Christy's own unsolved murder to finally face what he had done. But here is what 30 years could not change. Christy Wessleman was vibrant. Spirited. Gifted. Amazing. A class president at 15 with a trajectory that pointed somewhere significant. A girl who loved old movies and volleyball and her family and a Sunday afternoon with nowhere to be. She was not just a case number in a DuPage County file. She was an unfinished book. And the people who loved her have never stopped reading. What do you think should happen to killers who are released early and go on to take another life? Should the system that freed them share responsibility? Dana Henry lost his house, his money, and 30 years of his life to a suspicion that DNA proved was wrong, and he never received a single apology. Does that sit right with you? Christy's scholarship lives on at Glenbard South, awarded every year to the freshman class president she once was. If you could say one thing to her family after hearing this story, drop it in the comments below. And if this video moved you, please like it, share it, and subscribe so more stories like Christy's reach the people who need to hear them.